Hey everybody, welcome to Unit 11 of Economics is for Everyone. And today we're going to be looking at market structure. For some of you, you might think this is a little bit strange, or to talk about market structure so early on, or even at all in such a short course. But for me, I consider market structure to be pretty important because market structure basically supports the demand and supply models that firms use. So let's explore exactly what I mean by market structure. So here we have a fairly generic demand and supply graph. You have your supply going upwards and your demand going downwards. Now, I explained this in the previous video, demand and supply, and why that is the case. But market structure comes in because market structure affects the shape of your demand and your supply curves, and ultimately has an impact on the price and quantity of goods being sold. So in order to explain market structure, I'm going to be using the model that I have here in this diagram. So we have on the y-axis cost and price, and we have on the x-axis quantity. And what we have in this graph is that we have marginal cost and average cost, as well as marginal revenue and average revenue. And these three curves interact in order to determine our equilibrium price and quantity. So let's start off here with the marginal cost curve. Marginal cost curve, as you can see here, is mostly upward sloping in this model, and it intersects the average cost curve at the bottom of the average cost curve. This is also known, that intersection is productive efficiency. Well, I'll talk about that in another unit. The marginal cost curve also intersects both the average revenue and marginal revenue curves. So what does that basically mean? So if you got marginal revenue and you got marginal cost, when the marginal cost is lower than the marginal revenue, there is incentive to keep producing because the revenue you're getting from each unit sold is greater than the cost. But once marginal cost is greater than marginal revenue, then there's no incentive to continue producing because every single thing that you're producing costs more than what you're earning back when you're selling it. So that gives us the point where you'd want to sell your good, your quantity. The price that you sell it at, though, is not the price where the marginal cost and marginal revenue interact. That would be what we call along the demand curve, or in this case, the average revenue curve. So you can see as we go up to the average revenue curve, that's where we determine our price. So we've got our price and quantity you determine using this model. And this is what's going to be used for the four market structures that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So the four market structures I'm going to be covering in this unit are perfect competition, monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly. They're not the only market structures, but they're pretty much the most common ones and also probably the most relevant to most people. So let's start with perfect competition. So when we think of perfect competition, think of goods such as rice, for example. Whether you buy rice brand A or rice brand B, they're generally fairly similar. The same with something like potatoes. Different types of potatoes, more or less similar. So we're talking about are homogeneous products that vary very little. So therefore, you do not have any product differentiation at all. So the only competition that you have is through price. And whichever company or firm sells their product at the lowest price is going to pretty much capture the whole market. So therefore, if you think of it as they're competing with each other, lowering their own price, you get to a point where you get to your costs. So there's no point capturing the whole market if you're selling your product for less than your average and marginal cost, simply because you would be losing money, and that would be quite a lot of money. So firms compete with each other until they get to the marginal cost, the average cost. So you can see here from this diagram, we have the marginal revenue and average revenue is the same. So all firms are price takers. They have to accept this price, which is the average cost. And considering all the products are homogeneous, the average cost can be considered the same. And what's interesting about this is that you're at the bottom of your average cost curve, so it's considered to be productive efficient, and it's also considered to be allocative efficient as well. I'll explain a bit more about efficiency later on. Perfect competition, though, sounds great, but in reality, it's very, very rarely happens. I mentioned about rice and potatoes. Even those are not perfect examples of perfect competition, simply because there are some variation involved. And also, perfect competition doesn't allow for profit because you're always selling at cost. And this is a problem in the sense that profit helps to make improvements. Like, for example, a firm could use their profits to lower costs. They could use their profits to innovate. They could use their products to acquire different technology. The absence of profits, unfortunately, does not enable those performances. So in the end, your average cost may be higher than what it could have been if the firms are actually able to make more investment. Okay, the next market structure I'd like to talk about is monopoly. And monopoly is basically the exact opposite to perfect competition. So perfect competition, you have many firms that have no control over their price. A monopoly has complete control over their price, and it's generally one firm, or maybe one firm that has by far the largest share of the market. So as I explained a few slides back, a monopoly determines quantity by equating marginal cost with marginal revenue, as you can see from the diagram. And the price is on the demand curve. So at that quantity level, you go up to demand curve or the average revenue curve, and that's where you obtain your price. With monopolies, though, they tend to underproduce a particular good and overcharge. So we've got our marginal cost equals to our average revenue. That would be your allocated efficient output, which is quite a bit further along, as you can see here. And also, it's not productive efficient either, because the average cost curve is not at the bottom. So efficiency-wise, it's not particularly great. But for monopolies, though, they can be very profitable. And it could be argued that they could use their profit for innovation and technology, which you don't get with perfect competition. You could also argue that the lack of competition would make a monopoly complacent, and they could become even more inefficient. In the real world, monopolies rarely exist in the private sector. They often exist in the public sector run by governments. You often see governments actually have a monopoly over particular things. And many don't consider government monopolies to be as bad as private monopolies, because the government can regulate price down and don't necessarily follow the profit maximization. But government monopolies can also still be very inefficient, because there's still the problem of a lack of innovation. The next market structure I'd like to talk about is monopolistic competition. So monopolistic competition is somewhere between monopoly and perfect competition. So just like perfect competition, monopolistic competition has many firms. And similar to monopoly, though, monopolistic competitive firms are able to set their own price. And they follow the same rules I talked about: marginal cost equals to marginal revenue to determine their quantity. And then the price is determined by whatever the demand or the revenue might be at that point in time. Monopolistic competition, there may be many firms, but the products vary a little bit. So monopolistic competitions could be firms that are selling, let's say, drinks, or maybe restaurants, or maybe clothes. There could be many producers, and they can vary their products. So they can compete with each other through product differentiation, which allows them to set different prices. There's still a certain level of price competition, though, because they'll be within a particular bound of what people would be willing to pay for a particular product. Monopolistic competition enables profits in the short run, in the sense that firms can differentiate their products and therefore make a product based on that competition. It is believed, and according to the models, that they don't have long-run profits, though arguably say, when do you actually ever reach the long run? Because the markets are constantly dynamic. Firms are constantly making changes to their products. New firms are coming in, old firms are leaving. So monopolistic competitive firms are generally able to make some form of profit. It's not going to be as large as monopolies. Monopolistic competition as well would produce slightly under your efficient outputs. So your marginal cost equals to your demand average revenue would be a slightly higher quantity. And it's not normally productive efficient either. But the plus side is, as I mentioned, monopolistic competitive firms are able to earn a profit. And that profit can be used to innovate. That can be used to lower costs. So you may actually see your cost curves falling and output actually increasing. So monopolistic competition from that side of things, because of innovation and technology, could actually become more efficient than your perfect competitive firms, which do not have that incentive. This now brings me to the fourth and final market structure I'm going to be talking about in this unit, and that's oligopoly. So oligopoly in many ways is quite similar to monopoly, but instead of having just one large player controlling the market, you have several large players. So maybe you have 3, 4, 5, 6 large players in the market. And this is actually reasonably common in the private sector. And you may get large companies, for example, like Disney or Google or Microsoft or Walmart, etc. And they don't control the entire market, but they have a very, very large share of that market. So with oligopoly, there's a certain amount of monopoly power. And as I mentioned with the previous market structures, marginal cost versus marginal revenue is going to be most likely method of determining quantity. And the price, of course, would be determined at the demand curve, as you can see here. So what we have in an oligopoly, which makes it a little different from our other market structures, what we call a kink demand curve. So you can see the dotted line going down there through the marginal cost curve. So why is it kinked? Because there's very little incentive for a firm to increase their price. Because if they increase their price, they're going to lose a large chunk of their market share to the other big firms. But there's also very little incentive to decrease their price, because once they decrease their price, other firms will follow as well. So they'd actually lose money. So increasing price loses revenue, or should I say loses profits, and decreasing price loses profits. So therefore, price is actually very rigid. So it's unchanging. And this particular price could be determined through some sort of informal agreement amongst the very large oligopolies, or it could be more of an illegal agreement through what we call cartels. But generally, the oligopolies tend to be quite profitable. And with the profits, depending on the level of competition between the firms, this can be used for innovation and improvement and reducing costs, or a lot of it could be consumed. So that's a little bit of a debate in terms of how good oligopolies are. But oligopoly firms tend to be the largest in the world, so they're very successful on that front. And a lot of them have managed to keep their costs down. So you tend to see oligopolies in areas such as cell phones. I mentioned that before. No, I didn't. Cell phones, or maybe even in electricity and all that. Firms that were previously monopoly under government, so often privatized to then form oligopolies. That's another way oligopolies can be formed as well. So now I've covered the 4 market structures I intended to cover in this unit. So how do we determine what market structure firms are going to naturally fall into? I mentioned about homogeneous products and how that falls under perfect competition. I've also mentioned about product differentiation as well, but there's a little bit more to it than just that. And one key factor that I haven't mentioned so far, which plays a very critical role in what type of market structure you'll have, and that's what we call barriers to entry. Some markets are a lot easier to enter than others. And these barriers to entry, they could be imposed by governments, for example. Governments may restrict particular firms from entering for various reasons. Like, for example, government monopoly would be blocking out all private sellers. You may have barriers to entry such as your natural barriers to entry, for example, control over resources. You may have a cost structure that's not particularly favorable for many small firms. So only the larger firms can actually have this cost structure. And that's when you talk about economies of scale. So in order to achieve those economies of scale, you need to have large firms. And a particular market might be able to only hold a few particular large firms. There's also products that have patents on them as well, patents and copyrights and etc. And that blocks other firms entering the market. That's typically what we see in like pharmaceutical companies, for example, which are often under oligopolies, and they protect their products through these patents, which actually blocks other firms entering as well. And basically, it's the barriers to entry has, in my opinion anyway, the largest role in determining a particular market structure. Those barriers to entry, though, may not necessarily be permanent. They can be broken down. Like, for example, let's talk about economies of scale. That may only be practical for a few large firms, you might say. But it's possible that you can have smaller firms cooperating together on certain things in terms of innovation and technology, and they could do shared work. And we've seen that through open source projects and all that, where different firms are working together. So there are ways around barriers to entry. I get even the legal ones as well. Things can change, like patents can expire and so on. So market structures can change over time, but it requires the barriers to entry to also change as well. This now brings us to the end of this unit. It was a little bit technical, but I felt that it's necessary because market structure is quite critical in terms of determining our price and quantity, as well as the shape of our demand and supply curve. It's very useful for people wondering why, you're buying electricity and why there's just a few companies, or whereas, you're going out to the retail and there's lots of different retail stores selling lots of different things, and also helps us understand how pricing mechanisms work. So as a consumer, it's very useful to actually understand the market structures that you're dealing with, as well as some of the strengths and weaknesses of each structure. So our next lesson, we're going to be revisiting some of the stuff that we observed in the first few units. I think it's unit 3 up to about unit 6. And we're going to talk about what we've learned in terms of theory and how these theories actually apply to some of the observations that we've already made earlier on. So this should be interesting. This is starting to pull things together. Also breaks up the theory a little bit. We've had quite a few theory units in a row now. So taking a little bit off of theory, focusing back on application again. So hopefully you'll enjoy that and stay tuned. And oh yes, remember to have a quick look at the questions too. Thank you very much.